Welcome, everyone, to Pants on Fire, Exposing Ruling Class Lies. Today, we're joined by Merle Ratner to discuss the Vietnam Agent Orange Relief and Responsibility Campaign and other updates related to socialism in Vietnam. So welcome, Merle. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Kyle. I'm glad to join you and your listeners.
So let's start with just a brief introduction. Tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do and this campaign.
So I am someone who grew up during the anti-war movement against the U.S. imperialist war in Vietnam, and I got involved. I was arrested the first time in an activity which delivered a petition to the United Nations, which was called We Charge Genocide. It had been modeled after the We Charge Genocide campaign of African Americans in the U.S. against racism, segregation, and white supremacy. And in fact, some of those folks joined us. So I've been involved in this since I was 13. And after the war ended, I took part in solidarity with Vietnam, fighting to end the U.S. trade embargo and to normalize relations. And then in the last 18 years, we've been focusing a lot, although not entirely, on justice and accountability for the U.S.'s spraying of the chemical warfare weapon, Agent Orange, and also Agent Blue, Agent Purple, all together on the land and people of Vietnam. And we've had some small victories. So, for example, well, let me just say something about Agent Orange first. Agent Orange is a toxic chemical containing dioxin as its most toxic ingredient. And dioxin is a carcinogen. It has something to do with birth defects, although the causal connection is still being understood better. It causes all kinds of cancers, other killing issues, and serious birth defects. The many thousand U.S. veterans who were in Vietnam during the war are getting essentially compensation through the Veterans Administration for their illnesses. And now there's a presumption that anyone who was in country or now, I think, in the water as well, who got a long list of diseases is entitled to an enhanced, monetary package up to full disability, as well as treatment in the VA and other things. The Vietnamese have been given, of course, no such guarantee of assistance, and nor have the Vietnamese Americans and the children of male veterans who get very little. The children of female veterans get more. The children of male veterans here get very little. The Vietnamese Americans get nothing. And the people in Vietnam who've had their bodies and their lands really severely destroyed have gotten no permanent fixed thing. So what we've been able to demand from the U.S. is that the U.S. help clean up the areas where the Agent Orange was dumped, which are in the south and central parts of Vietnam. They're called hot spots, where there's Agent Orange in the soil and sediment, and people were getting sick from that even years after the war. And so now in Da Nang and Bien Hoa and Suna Lui, we hope to make the big ones. The U.S. is helping, along with the Vietnamese, to clean those up. In terms of the human victims, of whom there are many multi-thousands of victims all over the country, because this is because not only those who were directly exposed, who tended to get cancers and other kinds of serious deadly ailments, but their children, grandchildren, and now great-grandchildren are getting both birth defects and other illnesses. And some of them die in utero, and the sickest ones basically, have really bad deformations of their faces, their bodies, encephalitis with the big heads, as well as, some physical deformities. So some of the offspring are doing well, but just have to deal with the physical deformities. Others can't function at all, need, 24/7 care. And now their parents and grandparents are beginning to die. So there's a growing public health crisis of who's going to take care of these children. And so the U.S. has given small amounts of money, $1 million there, some 100,000 there, to aid first people with disabilities, because they didn't want to take responsibility for the Agent Orange and the dioxin. harms. Now they're saying a little bit more connected to dioxin, but it's still very piddly and insufficient. And up until now, it's been given to international and US NGOs who spent so much of it on studies and meetings and hotels, and that very little of it got to the victims. So another thing we've been struggling about is to get money to Vietnamese NGOs who know how to work with the victims. And the most important of those is the organization in Vietnam that actually represents the victim, which is our Agent Orange campaign's partner, the Vietnam Association for Victims of Agent Orange Dioxin. And they provide both advocacy with and for the Agent Orange victims, and they provide services to supplement what the government of Vietnam provides. Everything from home care services to developmental services, occupational therapy, physical therapy, childcare centers, visiting stuff, all, craft making, everything, along with the official government aid, which is significant but not enough because Vietnam is still a developing country. So our campaign was formed in 2005 after the Vietnam Association for Victims of Agent Orange Dioxin was formed. And they asked us, are you in solidarity? Can you help? And we said, of course, we've always been in solidarity, and this is the area of greatest need right now. So our campaign formed. We're a project of Veterans for Peace, which is a longtime progressive veterans organization. We also work with Vietnam Veterans Against the War, which is the anti-war veterans organization that was there during the war, that played that key role in exposing U.S. war crimes in the hearings that they held. And we work with the National Lawyers Guild, and we work with the Viet Left organizations that are developing. We work with a lot of organizations, but those are the core ones. Mm-hmm. And we have had 12 or 13 speaking tours of Agent Orange victims and people from their association. We've sent many delegations to Vietnam, and our kind of key action piece now, aside from educational work and fundraising, are the bills that we've had in the House of Representatives, sponsored by the wonderful Barbara Lee from the Bay Area. And those are, they keep changing the number because every new Congress they have to be introduced, but they're always named the Victims of Agent Orange Relief Act and then that year. So the last one was the Victims of Agent Orange Relief Act of 2021, and there'll be a new one for this new Congress being introduced soon. So we work with getting co-sponsors, we hold educational events in Congress, and we're thinking of having one introduced in the Senate. We were making real progress just before the COVID epidemic. We'd actually gotten some promises to get more support and maybe hearings, and then everything kind of, stopped. So we now are starting to ramp up again, and also working with some of the Vietnamese American groups that are supporting this, and we're supporting their legislation on immigration rights. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of I don't know if you have any other questions specifically. That's an overview.
Yeah, so you said that it's not just the victims who were exposed during that time, but you said it's also their children and their grandchildren. So is there still are there still levels of dioxin in the water, or how does it get passed for multi-generations?
There's two ways. So for people who live in the hot spots, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren could be exposed through the dioxin in the soil or sediment in the area, through eating the fowl, through being exposed to the sediment and soil in the water, whatever. Although I should just say, for people that like Vietnamese food, there's only very few cities that have that. So food from overall in Vietnam is very safe to eat. Mm-hmm. But those areas, one of which has been cleaned up, another of which is in process, for people that live there, that's a risk. But the more common one even is the epigenetic or genetic transmission. And I say those things because it's not clear whether dioxin acts directly to deform the gene or acts directly or indirectly to influence the way it functions, right? So genetics is, does it change the gene? And epigenetics is, how does it act upon the functioning of the gene, even if it doesn't transform it? And there's lots and lots of research now, because figuring out how it affects genetic is really hard to determine. even though everyone around the world, all the scientists say, yes, it does cause the cancers, the birth defects, all of these things, the diabetes, et cetera. But figuring out the exact mechanism is really hard. So now there's new research on epigenetics, which may be a little easier. And there seems to be some really promising science saying that, we don't know, but does it completely transform the genes? But it certainly acts on the way that they work, and it causes all these illnesses and birth defects. So people who were exposed to Agent Orange then have kids, then have grandkids, great-grandchildren that have some of these things. And the most serious for the younger people, for the generations after the original generation exposed, are birth defects, which are they range from very mild to completely incapacitated, where people, just lie in the bed. They have to be even restrained because, that they're both cognitively and brain-wise and physically disabled, so there's all kinds of really pretty horrific outcomes for the dioxin in the Agent Orange for younger generations, several levels of younger generations. And that's true here too. So there are children, both children of the few female vets, but children of the male vets who have the same birth defects that you see in Vietnam once their father was exposed to Agent Orange.
And so we're talking about a multi-generational issue that the U.S. created. And I think maybe a little backstory or background here is that one of the questions I saw on your website when I was reviewing everything was, what did the U.S. military know at the time?
Right. And we're pretty clear that they did know, and that the chemical companies knew. So the military gave out contracts to some of the worst corporate crime producers, polluters, and producers of weapons and toxic pesticides. So Dow Chemical and Monsanto, along with Diamond Shamrock and a bunch of other smaller ones. And there's evidence that Dow Chemical, at least, and probably most of the others, knew what it was doing. There had been other accidents, real kind of industrial accidents where this happened. So they did know, and they didn't care, basically. So we find that both the U.S. government was responsible and the chemical manufacturers. And the chemical manufacturers, some of them made even a more toxic Agent Orange with more dioxin because they didn't want to spend the money to do the kind of processes which would lower the level. They couldn't take it out the way it was formulated, but they could have lowered it. So a lot of them made a very dirty Agent Orange, which kind of compounded the problem. And scientists, like Matthew Meselson and a bunch of other scientists around the world, found this early, and the US used it, their allies in the South used it, and they basically didn't care. So I should say also that the Agent Orange victims in Vietnam and VABA, their association, did try to file a lawsuit in the US to get compensation, but the judge kicked it out basically because he said that it really wasn't a chemical weapon then. It didn't fall under it, or, and the government wasn't responsible because the companies made it, all that kind of stuff. So it went to all the way through the Court of Appeals, and then the Supreme Court refused to take the case. So, but there is a case in France. There's been a case in South Korea, saying that the government in Korea, that the Korean government was responsible, not for Agent Orange, but for the kind of war crimes committed by the South Korean troops in Vietnam. And the case in France is about Agent Orange. So there are attempts to take this to the courts, but as we know, it's very hard to get this kind of justice from U.S. courts. So the U.S. veterans did get a settlement from the government. From the chemical companies, not the government. They did get a settlement from the chemical companies. And I should say that the lawsuit filed here was against the chemical companies, not the government, because you can't sue the government unless it allows itself to be sued. So they tried to sue the chemical companies. The U.S. veterans did sue the chemical companies. They had a settlement, but it gave them very little. But they did get something. So this is kind of an ongoing struggle. that we're taking up. We've also done activities against Dow and Monsanto, particularly when they try to greenwash their products. Like Dow had a series of runs for clean water, and we, along with the Bhopal survivors in India, showed up and they stopped doing it. We kind of drove them out of that greenwashing.
Yeah, so you're talking about the 2004 lawsuit where they argued that well, the defendants in the case, so these were the chemical companies,
Mhm.
and this was the one where they said it was unfeasible and that it would infringe on Vietnam's sovereignty for them to provide any kind of compensation or reparation for the contamination.
Well, that's not what the judge ruled on. I mean, that was ridiculous to begin with.
Yeah.
Because Vietnam didn't say it would infringe on its sovereignty, so the U.S. chemical companies have no such. But that wasn't what the case was decided on. It was decided more on that the U.S. government wasn't responsible because the chemical companies made it, and that it wasn't properly classified as a chemical weapon. The treaty didn't cover it at that time. Things like that.
Yeah. And so then this went to the Supreme Court, you said, and then the Supreme Court just denied to move.
Denied certiorari. Yeah, they denied discussing it. So we lost in the district court, which is the original court. We lost in the Court of Appeals. We appealed to the Supreme Court, but they refused to hear the case. So that was it.
The justification of that to argue that it was not chemical, that the use of these chemicals was not chemical warfare is a little bit outrageous, right? I mean, that's exactly what it was. Right.
They were saying under some technicality of the chemical weapons, treaties, it didn't fall in it in time or whatever. If we'd been able to go to trial, then we would have been able to bring out evidence that it is a chemical weapon, but we didn't even get there. It was dismissed on a motion to dismiss.
And so, I mean, the use of Agent Orange and all these other toxic chemicals, the justification of that was that it was to deforest or to remove foliage. So they almost made it sound like this was more of an agricultural thing because they didn't want people to be able to hide.
Right. I mean, it's considered defoliant because it destroys greenery, forests, and all that. And it also then it's ecologically really damaging. Vietnam, we actually have heard it called ecocide. But yeah, it was to drive away the local people, the National Liberation Front, or anybody. So it's like a scorched earth policy. And it also then deprived people of crops and food for eating, which is by itself a war crime. So
right.
There were a whole bunch of war crimes and crimes against humanity kind of wrapped up into this.
Yeah.
We don't think that all of the ground level troops knew what it was doing, because there were actually pictures of some low level officer drinking it, showing that he was drinking it and how safe it was. So at that level, we don't think that all of the veterans, the soldiers knew, but at the highest level, they knew.
So, I mean, in addition to the human toll, we're talking about environmental damage and destruction.
Right. Forests, groves, mangrove kinds of things. Vietnam has a rich and varied ecosystem, and it was devastated by the war, particularly the chemical warfare, but also other kinds of the regular bombings. Not regular, the horrible bombings and things like that. But there are areas where the grass, even many, many years later, the original grass didn't grow. You had some kind of weird, scrubby, kind of grass that wasn't kind of supposed to be there. And then, of course, in the areas where it was dumped, it had a problem for the foods, the whole land, the food sources. People ate, ducks and other fowl and other things that had absorbed or gotten into their fatty tissue, because I think it lodges a lot in the fatty tissue of animals. So they got sick from eating it in those few areas. I think it's like 8 areas in the center and south, mainly smaller towns. So yeah, I mean, it really did screw with the ecosystem of Vietnam, and Vietnam is still recovering from it. And then along with that, of course, they have the impact of global warming, which is very severe in Vietnam because it's a long, skinny country with a huge coastline. So
yeah. So I in researching this, it reminded me also of a person that I know here in Austin. This guy, he's in his early 70s, and he was in Vietnam. He was a Vietnam vet, and he has severe lung disease.
Mhm.
He's on oxygen,
Yep.
and he had a lot of trouble with the VA initially because he was in Cambodia. And according to the government at that time, we were not in Cambodia. So they wouldn't give him any kind of assistance with healthcare or any compensation, because I think that's something I've learned over time, is that the government, the US government, does not like to admit when it was wrong or admit any mistakes. I think it took another, I don't know how many years before they even acknowledged that they were in Cambodia.
Right, right. And Laos too.
Yeah.
I mean, that there was use of Agent Orange in Laos and Cambodia, particularly in the border areas. But was he in Vietnam as well, or no?
Yes, he was.
So it doesn't matter then if where else he was. The law at that point, and still for the most part, if you set your feet down for one day in Vietnam, you're presumed to have Agent Orange not connected, Agent Orange associated diseases if you have anything on the VA's list.
Yeah.
You didn't have to show you're exposed. You don't have to show you were in a particular area. You just have to have been in Vietnam during the war period and have that long list of like 16 now. Heart cancers, all the different diseases on that list. The Institute of Medicine continually updates the list. So now it's ischemic heart disease, it's cancers, it's, diabetes, it's a lot of different things.
Yeah, I was looking at the list. It's just endocrine system,
right.
the logic system. I mean, it pretty much every body system
Yep.
is affected in some way. So one thing that you mentioned in your introduction that I wanted to get back to is that the VA provided compensation to US veterans who were there, and some compensation has been provided to the Vietnamese victims in terms of like one particular hotspot location that they cleaned up.
Yeah, they're working on the second one now. The US is helping with the second one as well.
So how long did it take before any acknowledgement was made and before any type of restitution was done?
Well, as I said, there hasn't been real restitution for the people. They've gotten some aid through USAID and given through other organizations, but it's really, pretty low level and completely uncommensurate with the need and the scope of the human health effects. For the cleaning up of the hotspots, that took some time. I don't remember when the first one was, but it took at least like 10, 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
Before that, they did give a little money to the quote disabled, which included Agent Orange victims, but they didn't even want to say, they just wanted Agent Orange victims to be called disabled along with others. They didn't want to acknowledge anything. Yeah. They still haven't said we're responsible, we did this, but they're now like, yeah, well, something about dioxin, probably, they don't shun the word anymore completely as they did before. And that's a lot because our campaign, and particularly the Agent Orange Victims Association in Vietnam and international groups as well, have been doing educational work, have been doing organizing, have been doing mobilizing to put pressure on the US government to say, and our champions in Congress like Barbara Lee, Rashida Tlaib, people from the squad, people in the Senate like Vermont Senator who's just retiring. My mind is going, it's been a long day. The senator from Vermont who's about to retire, a bunch of other, people in the Congress. We've had support from trade unions. We've had support from Black liberation organizations because Vietnam has always has a special relationship to the Black community here, going back to the days of Ho Chi Minh and his time in Harlem, etc. So we've gotten, Vietnam has gotten a tremendous amount of international support and support in the US, which has kind of helped move the needle. But really the Vietnamese Agent Orange victims and their association have played a kind of key role in keeping this in the spotlight for the public all over the world.
So what would it take in terms of a dollar amount, I guess, or what specifically is the organization seeking? I see on the website, obviously there's people can go and read the bill, and it also states that there was a promise of a certain amount, and that amount has not been paid yet.
That was in the Paris Peace Accords, which was a period in which Vietnam and the US made an agreement to stop the war for the most part, and to have a period of kind of stasis. It was kind of what's the word? Not détente, where you have even forces. And so in that period, part of those Paris Peace Accords, which were negotiated in Paris, was that the US would give, millions and millions and millions of dollars to Vietnam to heal the wounds of war. So what happens after that is, during that period of kind of stalemate, that's what it's called, stalemate, when the US had withdrawn most of its troops, and there were still two countries, and you still had the US backed puppet government in the South. The people in Vietnam and the liberation forces said, like, we're not going to sit here forever. We're going to win a liberation. And so they started, and cities and towns and hamlets from the demilitarized line down all the way to the bottom got liberated. And the puppet government had to leave. The US had to completely leave. And then the US decided to punish Vietnam by placing an embargo, a complete aid embargo against Vietnam, aid and trade embargo, and by saying, we're not giving you, we're not going to abide by the terms of the Paris Peace Accords. So they actually made Vietnam, in exchange for normalizing relations in 1995, 20 years after the end of the war and liberation, they actually made Vietnam pay reparations to the US for people whose businesses had been nationalized when people fled. I mean, it's really ironic.
Wow.
You can't imagine how disgusting it is that the US made Vietnam pay millions of dollars in reparations for the so-called, the property interests of people who shouldn't have been there to begin with. And, so.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could say it was shocking and surprising, but
no, it's not. Yeah, the US does that all over the world. But for people that are not so familiar with imperialism and US foreign policy, it should be shocking. But it's part of an ongoing pattern. That's what capitalism and imperialism do to other countries. And that's what they do to working people in the US too, in a different way. So it's kind of all one of a piece. In terms of what it's going to take to fix it, there were some kind of foundations that had suggested, I think, 300 million, something like that. But we think it would actually take like a couple billion, but we're not going to get that from the Congress here. So what we're trying to do is address the most urgent needs, which are the children, the cleanup, which is already happening, and the human needs of the later generations of children whose parents are dying or grandparents are dying, and who are now without caregivers and are severely disabled. That is part of the broader care structure that the Vietnamese government and the Agent Orange Association there have set up.
So what can people do, people who are listening, what can they do to help?
I think they can go to our website, which is www.vn-agentorange.org, and read about things, sign the orange postcard for the bill, which will be transferred over to the new bill. If they want to send money, they can support our campaign, and they can also, part of what we get goes to Agent Orange victims in Vietnam. They can ask for speakers, they can do educationals. We have speakers that we send out to different places. They can go to Vietnam and meet the Agent Orange victims and help out a little, or at least show solidarity. There are a lot of things that people can do.
So let's talk about some of the updates and some of the other things happening in Vietnam right now. It sounds like when we first started talking before we recorded, it sounds like there's quite a bit going on.
Yeah, so let me start with COVID, okay? So Vietnam, despite being a developing country, although it's developing well, and it's gotten out of the lowest range developing country to the middle range of developing countries, and it has plans to become more and more developed. during COVID, Vietnam used its amazing public health system and its grassroots kind of organizing and organization development to basically have zero COVID until the second stage of COVID came. And then that was much more virulent. And then they ended up having, serious casualties. But even then, the percentage of casualties is like a tiny percentage of the US's per capita. Even then, they were able to quarantine people, to get people vaccinated, even though it's hard for them to get vaccines because they don't have a lot of money. They managed to do that. They managed to have kind of quarantining in a way that everyone was taken care of. They had food, they had access to medicine, doctors. And then as things got better, as more and more people got vaccinated, they used the quarantines in a really sensible way. So they didn't just quarantine everybody. They had very targeted quarantines or stay-at-homes or other policies, which didn't stop the entire economy forever, but kind of targeted key places. And now almost all the restrictions have been lifted, although, they're encouraging people to wear masks, get vaccinated and all that. But they're still watching out for big, outbreaks and what they can do to target them. So overall, despite the second stage being harder, Vietnam was a huge success story in terms of COVID. And its economy did better than almost any other economy in the region and a lot in the world. So it didn't shrink. It certainly grew by a smaller amount, but they're in a pretty healthy shape. And now their target for their economic growth is like 7 or 8%, which I think is pretty impressive given that they're still coming off of COVID. But more important, they learned, I think there was a lot of experience of the benefits of the socialist system and the grassroots organization of people at the block level, community level, the women's union, the youth union, the farmers union. All of these things were kind of a way of people collectively to support each other, in addition to what the government or the Red Cross or whoever could do. And they worked really well. That was a confirmation of some of the benefits of what they built. The other thing that Vietnam's been doing a lot of things, but one to kind of point out now is the question of corruption and opportunism, which are kind of tied together. So Vietnam has very clear laws that, if you work for the government, and especially as a higher level official, you're supposed to put the people's needs above your own. So yes, you should get paid decently, you should get treated well, but you're a public servant. And Ho Chi Minh always said that never steal even a needle from the people, meaning, you're there. If you need to sacrifice for the people, you should do it, right? So that's kind of the ethics of Vietnamese socialism, Ho Chi Minh tradition. As happens in a country that's still, developing, as happens in a country that has a mixed socialist-oriented market economy that needed the market economy to grow and to overcome the lack of enough development and enough industrialization in the country, and a poor country at that point. You then have more opportunities and chances for corruption. And there's always people that will take advantage of it. And then, so before they were looking at corruption on the lower levels, so that the guy on the street who stops, the traffic cop who stops your motorbike and asks for money for dinner, right? Which is it's corrupt. You're not supposed to do that. And if you don't give it, they may stop you more. But, it's kind of more understandable. Now they're really tackling it with Nguyen Phu Trong, who's been the Secretary General of the Communist Party of Vietnam, is now in his second term. He's really kind of an incorruptible, communist with a long history in the party, went through the war, all of that. He's been making a huge focus of his, not only making people's lives better, but stopping corruption, which really, threatens to tarnish the revolution and the reputation of the party. So he's been conducting what he's called a blazing furnace campaign against corruption. And it has caught, a lot of leaders, corporate leaders, government leaders, and party leaders. And recently it went up to the highest levels. So 2 deputy prime ministers, a whole lot of other leaders of different ministries were either fired or some of them were put into jail. The 2 deputy prime ministers and then the president of the country just resigned because they were being punished not for being corrupt themselves, but for allowing it to go on their watch and for not knowing that it was there, because I think they may not have. But the other people from other ministries and offices were actually put to court and put in jail. So this is both having real impact on corruption, showing that it won't be tolerated, but also it is showing that, the ethics of the party and the revolution. So as I said, two of the deputy prime ministers, one of whom used to be foreign minister, and the president of the country have resigned. And this has sent kind of a message that we are building a revolution for the people, not for the elite, not for the heads of different government organizations. And the people have really welcomed it. And actually, we just found out that the person who has been nominated to be the new president is a person named Vo Van Thuong, who's 52 years old, who's I think the youngest president in many years, much younger than me, which is always amazing to me that I'm older than leaders. And he comes out of the Ho Chi Minh Communist Youth Union, which is the Communist Youth Union in Vietnam, and also other youth work. And he's basically been a party builder and a party educator. And I know him quite well. He's an amazing guy. He'll be a great president, and possibly even more, because the current party secretary is quite old and has some illnesses, so this will be his last term. So this is another potential thing. But having him as president is a really good sign for the party and the people, because he will be incorruptible. He will continue to work with the Secretary General against corruption. And he's also somebody that, has studied Marxism, is really, as most leaders are in Vietnam, but is really serious about the transformation and ending up in socialism, that this is a long transition period, but they're clear that where it's going to go is socialism, not social democracy, not some other kind of capitalism. And I think that that's a really positive thing.
Yeah, it's good to see that dedication, and it's incredible to see such high leadership positions just resign. I think that's something that, we don't see a lot, and obviously the media doesn't really cover this. We don't hear about Vietnam.
Yeah, I just want to say that while the top three resigned, there's a boatload of slightly less high-ranking but very high-ranking folks that went through a trial and are spending many years in jail for this.
Wow.
So the people that are allowed to resign are the people kind of where the buck stops here. So there's no allegation that they themselves were corrupt or knowingly allowed corruption, but that they didn't try hard enough to find out and to check, and therefore they're responsible and they shouldn't be in public office. The people that actually did the corruption, there were two examples that people were very angry about recently. One is during the COVID crisis, some companies made COVID supplies that were substandard and took large profits. And then other officials in the foreign ministry and some other ministries hyped up the price of the return flights for Vietnamese overseas who wanted to go home during COVID, and so made huge profits off of overcharging overseas Vietnamese. And those two things were particularly galling to people because it was during a COVID crisis and these are people taking advantage. So the people that knowingly took part in that are serving jail terms or are going to serve jail terms. The people the top leaders who failed to discover that are the ones that are being allowed to resign.
So with regard to socialism in Vietnam and just news in general about Vietnam, where can people go to find out more? Because I know that they can't go to New York Times and CNN and all of that.
Yeah, that's hard. There isn't a lot of good stuff written. Like I have to go to a ton of places. For current news, I would just Google Vietnam and socialism or Actually, well, you could go to Vietnamese, the Vietnam News Agency, Vietnam Courier, Vietnam Women's Union, Vietnam Youth Union. There's the Vietnamese theoretical journal, Pop Chi Kong's Vietnam Review or something like that. The Communist Review. There's the Ho Chi Minh Political Academy. They have their website for people interested in theory. There's different Vietnamese newspapers, youth newspapers, one. So if you Google Vietnamese newspapers or go to Vietnam News Agency, you'll get stuff in English. that's done by Vietnam.
Mhm.
It's mainly news. It's not so much deep analysis. I also understand we're supposed to be doing another webinar with the Communist Party that will analyze. We did one webinar you can provide the link to
Yeah.
that was on socialism in Vietnam, and that's very current. Yeah, so those are the kinds of things I would urge people to do. There are books written and websites, but most of them are kind of, not exactly accurate.
That was a great webinar. And I look forward to the next one. And I think that we'll have probably lots more questions for you. And anything else coming up that you want to talk about, or any big things happening with the campaign?
The campaign, as I said, is going to get the new bill introduced in the House, and then we need to get co-sponsors. And once it's introduced, people can actually also help us get co-sponsors by going to their Congress member and saying, we're your constituent, could you sign on to the Agent Orange bill that Barbara Lee is shepherding. That's another thing that people can do. Yeah, we're not sure when we're going to have our next delegation because of COVID, but we will have delegations coming from Vietnam. We will be sending delegations to Vietnam once it's a little safer.
So everyone should go to vn-agentorange.org, read all about it, and donate if you can, and sign the postcard.
Yep.
And follow on social media as well.
Yep. Yeah, we do have a Facebook page. We might have a Twitter page. I think we do, but I don't really go on social media much. But we do have social media you can follow. I will be updating the website soon.
I think it's a really good website. I was reading all about it today and getting angrier and angrier at what I was reading, just about the backstory of how, what all the US has done. But there's hope. Yeah,
there's always hope. And that's one thing also about Vietnam. I mean, they went through one of the longest and nastiest wars against the French colonialists, against US imperialists, and they went through unbelievable. The stories, you think that they're fiction, the kind of things that they went through, but they always had hope. They always believed, that Vietnam would win. We used to have a song, Vietnam will win. And they always believed that generation after generation. And they always said, even if it's not our generation, our children's generation will win. And that kind of optimism, that kind of hope, that kind of tenacity and strength and joy in the idea of the revolution is something that I've always learned a lot from.
I think we could all learn a lot from that.
Yeah. I mean, we could use that here.
Absolutely.
Sometimes, there's a tendency to give up. You have a setback and it's like, oh, I can't handle this anymore. And whenever I see that, or even in myself, I think about my friends who were in the tiger cage prisons being tortured by the US and the South Vietnamese, or people, in the jungle, living in the, countries, living there, trying to fight back and defend their land and people. And I think, well, my little setback, or even my big setback, is something that from the comfort of my apartment in New York, I can certainly surmount and struggle and do better next time. And together we can win. Yeah.
Merle, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Kyle. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to Pants on Fire, Exposing Ruling Class Lies, the podcast produced by the International Department of CPUSA. Visit our website, cpusa.org, to learn more about the party. Follow us on Twitter at CPUSA Department, and subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast app.